Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Oh boy, I didn't think of how to set this up.
Hello and welcome to Marxism Today. I am Red Wagner.
I'm Tony Schmidt.
I'm Thad Logan.
And today I want to try something a little bit different, guys. This is a blast from the past. Something that has been around for a long time and is not too serious. This is a lighthearted topic, but I want to try something a little different for us. Back in the 90s, there was a rock band called the Presidents of the United States of America.
Heck yeah, there was.
And they had a hit single, Peaches, that you may remember.
Oh my gosh. Yes, I do.
I literally looked this up a week ago because it popped into my head and I hadn't heard it in so long.
There is a famous or infamous article or paper or blog post. I'm going to go with blog post. It's not very well written, but there's a famous piece written about Peaches, an interpretation of it from a Marxist viewpoint.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think it's the most sophisticated piece, but I thought it would be fun to talk about it a little bit. So at this time, we're going to play a short clip of Peaches for our listeners. We'll listen to the whole thing. Listeners, if you want to pause and listen to the whole thing, you can. I don't think that we can play the whole thing for you. And we are going to read the piece on it, which is actually quite short. It's probably 1 page or so. So if you want to look up the piece, you can Google it or you can look in the show notes. We'll have a link to it there. We'll pause for now and we'll see you again in just a moment.
Moving to the country, I'm gonna eat a lot of peaches. I'm moving to the country, I'm gonna eat me a lot of peaches. I'm moving to the country, I'm gonna eat a lot of peaches. I'm moving to the country, I'm gonna eat a lot of peaches. Peaches come from a can, they were put there by a man in a factory downtown.
We just, the three of us, read the essay and also listened to the tune. There's one framing thing that I want to say. The author here writes a good almost the same message, where he says, okay, I'm making this argument for interpretation at the very beginning, and then he says, but that doesn't necessarily mean I agree with it. Okay, that's understood, that you can make the point that some piece of art is making an argument that you don't agree with. That's fine. On top of that, I'm also going to say that the intention of the artist is one way to look at a piece of art, but it's not the only way. And I do know I've seen some interviews with the Presidents of the United States of America group who say, yeah, the song has nothing to do with communism or Marxism or whatever. It's just, hey, we wrote this song. But from my point of view, the things that you create as an artist, you don't really know always why you say all of those things. It's just a reflection of what's inside of you. And what's inside of you is part of the culture, because you're part of the culture. So, just because that wasn't your intention when you created the piece doesn't mean that you didn't accidentally create a piece that has a lot to say about capitalism, or maybe it has nothing to say about capitalism, but the artist's intention is only one thing to look at, and it's not the be-all, end-all of any piece of art.
Yeah, totally agree. Like authority, it's just one side of the equation, and how people interpret something You can get pretty loose definitions of like any interpretation's okay. It still has to be supported by what you see in there. But that's one thing I want to point out here too is whether this kid is in high school or not. Like I think they do a pretty good job of finding examples to support their thesis here. They're pretty good at interpreting it. I think they'd be a pretty good English major, actually. I like a lot of the things they point out. They take some stretches, but they're a little creative, and I think it makes it charming, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's definitely, if I were writing this, there are definitely things that I would change about this,
Yeah.
and things that and little things that we could pick apart if we wanted to. But as far as making the case goes, well, I don't know if I want to jump there right now. But do you want to start with your reflections?
I was just gonna say, I think this author in their doctoral dissertation on this topic. Sorry, no, I'm just being mean. I think that the author doesn't exactly understand communism, like the idea of like going out of like the cities and like sort of living as one with nature is almost sort of more of an anarchist type idea, specifically like an eco-anarchist idea, and is actually a conservative thing as opposed to a progressive communist thing. And he makes the assumption, and I don't think the song says it at all, that peaches in a can are bad. Like he makes the assumption, his interpretation has it as like a bad thing, like they're defacing the pure nature of it. Whereas really, the song doesn't say that, and I think you should make the argument for communism, the fact that we can take something that only grows once a year and be able to preserve it and have food for people the rest of the year that tastes, maybe not as great as it does fresh, but still pretty close and good, that's a very positive forward step. So that off the bat is something that drew my eye the most.
Sure, one of the things you brought up is something I wanted to talk about too, which is this author's idealization of the country, and I do think that is part of the song. I feel like the song is idealizing the country, and the author of the essay recognizes that. And I think that there are different branches of that. You mentioned that there's a kind of the conservative branch of that, which I think is part of, like, being free and living on your own. It's almost this, like, fantasy of capitalism. It's the image that capitalism likes to sell, that you produce on your own and you trade with others. Like, it's the, individual small producer trading with other producers. That's kind of the image that capitalism presents to us, in America at least, because that's a nicer picture than, oh, you've got this lower class that works for the capitalists and blah, blah, blah. So the image capitalism says, they say, this is what capitalism is. It's people making something on their own and then going out to the market and selling it. And they are rewarded based on the quality of their product. So that's the conservative part of it, which I think totally ties into this idealization of the country. However, I think that there is a communist way to do it too, which I think you kind of recognized in what you called an eco-anarchist method. I don't think it's necessarily tied explicitly or only to eco-anarchist. I think that it's a good point that it's kind of more aligned with that. But I think escaping to the country can be tied in with communism in the sense that I feel like the city is, in fact, a really good representation of modern capitalism. The living format of capitalism, the way that capitalism organizes people and resources, is largely into cities. And we're seeing that even today, where lots of towns are disappearing off the map because the last person who lived there moved out of them. They're gone, and more of the population lives in what are cities now. So I think it is a good point that the idealization of the country and saying I'm moving to the country is a rejection of the real life lived capitalism of the world. However, it's not clear whether it's a rejection of that in favor of the idealized capitalism, or if it's in rejection of the real-life lived capitalism for an alternative. That's something that I'm not sure the song makes clear.
Also, there's not a large place there for revolution in the song. He talks about it later, like at the end, with the music sort of supports a more like aggressive stance, and it seems, and they say, look out, like revolution is coming. But he also says that, and then I keep saying he, who knows? This could have been a girl.
We're assuming a male author.
Sure. But he says that they either leave to go to the country or go to another country. And in my mind, that is a little bit different about, like, when I hear you guys talk about what needs to happen in this country. We couldn't all just like run away and fix things. Really, it's not an effective way to reform sort of the structure of things here. And I thought that was a little striking in this, is that they just take off. And they certainly just take off in the song, but in his analysis of it too, it's like, oh, we're getting away, and it seems like a nice fantasy. Like, you're getting away to that Never Never Land, and things are better now. But why did they just stay better there? And he says, oh, I guess another country, but doesn't really end up changing things.
I think it's interesting that he does say the country as a place out, in a rural area.
Yeah.
And then he also says, well, maybe country means a different country. In other words, a different nation.
Right.
That struck me as very odd and interesting when I first read this, because I had never interpreted the song when it said country to mean a different country. I think that is a product of maybe the time frame in which this was written. I think the Soviet Union was probably more of a real thing at that time. I don't know exactly if the Soviet Union was gone by the time this was written. That could be, but it was still at the very least in recent memory. The idea that there could be a socialist nation that you could move to. And maybe there still are. There are places that you could call social democratic nations, the Scandinavian countries that Bernie Sanders likes to talk about. Of course, there's Cuba, but I think the idea of moving to a socialist country is something that is largely off the table in today's discussions, especially among socialists. That the discussion is much more about changing our country or changing the world.
Did it strike a chord with you, or was it noticeable to you with how much this author wanted to clarify that they did not condone these views, not only at the start, but at the end as well? Like, there's a strong impulse that even when you're exploring ideas of socialism and communism, you need to socially insulate yourself from those ideas. And maybe this is this is kind of a very innocent version of that, but I think that exists like in a big way and larger scale too.
I completely agree. It was striking to see how far out of his way the author would go to say that he does not believe in communism, nor does he agree with it, and he's just saying that the song has some aspects of that. Honestly, what I thought was the vibe I got from it was that the author has some sympathies for the ideas of communism. Like, in the middle of the essay, I felt like he was characterizing communism as quasi-favorable. And only at the disclaimer and in the conclusion, where he feels the need to call back to that disclaimer, does he say, I don't support this. So the feeling that I got was it's someone who's interested in these ideas, who's interested in Marxism, interested in communism, but feels afraid or for some reason that he cannot fully associate with them.
We could wrap this podcast like that.
Well,
I'm thinking
at the end of every episode.
Hello, just because we talk about Marxism and socialism and communism and call ourselves Marxist does not mean that we are or believe any of the above.
Or vote for Trump, 2016.
I would hope that the author of this piece today would write it differently. And by that I mean not because he's older, I mean just like in the sense that I think today you are more free to talk about these ideas. And I think that's part of Bernie's success right now, as well as he is doing. I think that since the Soviet Union has fallen and the Cold War becomes a thing of the past, that a lot of people, younger people, the Cold War was not a part of their political memory, or, there's plenty of people born in this country now that weren't alive during the Cold War even, or were too young to remember it. But as that portion of the population grows and grows, I think it becomes more and more acceptable to actually look at these questions and to say, what do we want our economic system to be? And ask that honestly. The Cold War kind of cast this big shadow over the whole country and over this debate to say, you're not really allowed to talk about this. And you can try to pretend to talk about it, but your conversation really needs to boil down to just be a big cheerleading session for capitalism. That's the only capacity at which you can talk about this subject. Now you can talk about it, I think, more freely. So I think part of all of the hedging that we see going on in this article is, I hope, just a relic of the times.
Yeah. Also, from when apparently Peaches came out was 1998, so that was 6 years after the fall of the USSR. So yeah, pretty recent memory then.
Another thing that you brought up earlier I wanted to come back to was the bit in the song where he talks about peaches come from a can. They were put there by a man in a factory downtown. The author of the essay recognizes this as something that needs analysis, that somehow plays into the Marxist factor in the song. But I'm surprised, as someone who identifies as a Marxist, I'm surprised that he doesn't bring up the term that immediately comes to mind for me.
The man. Right?
It would be commodity fetishism.
No.
So normally in capitalism, what you're supposed to do is see the can of peaches on the supermarket shelf, see how much it costs, and only think about that. Say, these peaches cost $1.35 or whatever, and either it's a good deal or it's a bad deal or, whatever. By saying they come from a can and they were put there by a man in a factory downtown, what you're doing is de-fetishizing the commodity. You're explaining the entire social relations of what this commodity is. And well, I should say not the entire social relations. To really know that, or at least to know it enough to the point where I think it's super useful.
You need to go to the countries to see all the peaches?
I was going to say you'd want to know how much the workers were paid and how much the capitalists took from the workers.
Oh yeah, that too.
Because that's part of the social relation is out of the amount that is made from these peaches, out of the total revenues, how much goes to the rent and how much goes to interest and how much goes to the workers and how much goes to the capitalists and how much goes to their top level managers. How do they divide the social product? Because that's all the price of something and all of the selling of something is different ways of dividing up the social product. And by purchasing that item, you're devoting an extra $1.35 or whatever it is to that entity, but then that entity divides that $1.35, which if you add up everyone's $1.35 is whatever, millions or billions, depending on the size of the operation, is a lot of money. And they're dividing that up in whatever way they see fit. So, to remind folks that that's how the commodity comes on the shelf, I think is a very Marxist thing. The author kind of writes that, like kind of calling back to what you mentioned earlier, Tony, he kind of gets caught up with this whole, condemning of factories, which I don't think is a socialist stance. The idea that we could use science and technology and industry to do wonderful things like preserve food, that's something that communists would support. But to understand how that functions in a capitalist society, it is itself a Marxist stance. To kind of ignore that fact and ignore the history behind the commodity, that would be the normal ideology of capitalism. To think about it, that would be Marxism.
I'm still also with this shocked that they didn't pick up on the last part where it's millions of peaches, peaches for me, millions of peaches, peaches for free. Like, that's a pretty anti-corporate message at very least.
Mm-hmm.
And for all of their wrangling about other stuff, it's maybe they thought that one was just too on the nose to have to mention or something, but it's kind of weird that that was left out of their analysis.
Yeah, I think at the very least, I mean, one of the critiques that gets thrown against socialists and social democrats alike is that the things that are called free are not really free. And I actually stand by that. For example, universal health care, that's not really free health care. That's health care that we all pay for, but we all pay for it together and we all receive it together. And if we're going to be honest, we have to recognize that fact, and I think it is good to recognize that fact. You know, when the NHS, the National Health Service, came out in Great Britain, or in England, the propaganda for it, the advertisements for it, told you this is not a charity. You pay for it with your taxes. And I think part of that probably was so that people would accept it and actually use it, because people didn't want to take charity if they didn't think they deserved it or needed it or whatever. But I think that's something to be proud of, to say, yes, we do pay for this. Part of the work I do pays for the houses and food and everything else of the salary, essentially, of the workers who work to provide all of us with health care. And I think that's a wonderful thing. But I'm not against, it's kind of tough, because I think, okay, does free mean everything that I just said? Or does free kind of hide everything that I just said, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if free is the right word to use or not. If it is the right word to use, then it has to mean everything that I just outlined. But either way, saying in the song, peaches for free, that's clear, whatever free means in that context, it's clearly a distinction from the capitalist mode of production. Because capitalism will distribute those commodities based on whoever has the money to pay. So, you know, those peaches are not free, they cost something. And the way we decide who gets those peaches is whoever has the money to buy them. If a family really needs peaches or food or whatever, but they don't have the money for it, in capitalism, too bad, so sad, you don't get that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe instead of free, we should say no immediate cost to the direct consumer. Or the immediate.
Doesn't fit into the chorus quite as well.
Yeah.
But
I think it could be worked in.
If you could put that in an iambic pentameter, then maybe we could talk.
Oh boy.
there's a line that one I think has the most striking visual metaphor that the author uses, which is squished a rotten peach in my fist. Because we've established that peaches are whether they have come to represent capitalism and also freedom from capitalism in the song, but a rotten peach would probably be the taint and corruption of capitalism, and this is you're squeezing it away. But then the line after that is "and dream about you, woman," and the author says that this is because communists have been associated with lacking masculinity, and I want to see why is that true? Like historically, because I don't remember anything like that from like the Red Scare, where they specifically talked about them being feminine. Is this due into just like the perspective of this author being a little like uninformed, or is that actually something that's substantive?
Go ahead.
It's nothing I'm aware of specifically, but I mean, people will do the thing where they just lump a bunch of what they consider negative things together and hurl it at
Sure.
someone.
Yeah.
So maybe in that way, maybe they've heard that, like some sort of derogatory thing. I'm not trying to say what's actually in my head. Some sort of derogatory thing towards them. Maybe we'll just,
Because when I heard that line,
like faggy commie or something like that,
right?
Or,
Yeah. Well, definitely foreigner can sometimes be associated. Like the liberal foreigner can be seen, at least nowadays, as being someone who is less masculine than a conservative right American. But because it's funny, because when I hear that line, "Squish a rotten peach in my fist and dream about you, woman," I think like, oh, the woman is liberty or something, or the woman is a dream that you have, a nice dream that you are that you want to attain. Like, it sounds
communism.
nice to me. Right. That's exactly what I mean. She's sort of like this personification of communism, or a communist ideal, and then and you're dreaming about it as you squeeze that rotten peach. But he took it in a derogatory way.
I think it's really interesting the association that the author has between communism and being feminine. At first I think it is striking as a little bit odd, because if you look at all of the different political ideologies, in many ways communism comes off as actually kind of like hyper masculine sometimes. Especially the communists who are kind of like the old guard Stalinist. Like, there's a certain branch of communism that I think likes and appeals to a sort of militaristic frame of mind. However, at the same time, I think that there is maybe a little something to what he's saying. It's not completely weird. When you compare the Soviet Union or other communists to the general, like, capitalist status quo, capitalism, it was clear, had made an alliance with patriarchy. It took the sexism that was there before capitalism came into existence and decided to use that as part of itself. So capitalism, for a long time, in the U.S. and so forth, was very sexist. Women weren't allowed to vote or have property, and just socially, even today, they may have all of these legal equalities that they're entitled to. They're not, when you look at the social statistics, actually treated equally. Communism, however, like, for example, the Soviet Union, it was one of the first places to have women soldiers. Partially because of need. They just needed more people to fight. And, I think one of the most, one of those, interesting facts I didn't know about the Soviet Union is that the Soviet Union had one of the best snipers in the whole world, and she was a woman. One of the best snipers in the world was a woman, and she fought for the Soviet Union because they just needed bodies. And so, when you need bodies, you don't care very much whether they're men or women. And I think, in general, communists are pretty into the idea of gender equality. Now, if you live in a patriarchal society, and if you're a little sexist yourself, you might see gender equality as feminine. So I don't think that the author is completely off base with saying that communism is feminine in the sense that it's ideally gender equal. But I don't think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, I don't think that the phrase "dreamed about you, woman," I don't think there's enough evidence in the text of the song to say that is a call to the fact of the gender equality of communism or to any femininity in communism itself. I felt like that was a little bit of a stretch when I read the essay. I wanted to say something about the rotten peach part. I like this part of the song because there is tension in this part of the song. You can feel it in the music. It's building some tension. The author of the essay points out that a fist represents power and anger, I'm surprised he doesn't call out that a fist is generally the power of left-wing struggle. If you see a lot of symbols on the left, you'll see a fist, or sometimes if they want to be more specific, a fist holding something in particular. And that I feel like that imagery could really play into the building of an argument for this being a Marxist song.
Mm-hmm.
To say that you've got the image of a fist, crushing something rotten,
Mm-hmm.
and that totally plays into the imagery that the left has used traditionally.
Yeah, I can see that. Just a fist in the air crushing a peach. You see it exploding out to the sides. And then a fist, two other fists behind, one holding a hammer and one holding the sickle.
Right? like for example, if you were trying to get a farm workers union together, and this particular group of people you were trying to organize are people that pick peaches, oh yeah, you better believe that the symbol that gets chosen, or at least one of the ones that gets nominated, is a fist holding a peach up in the air.
Yeah. That's also it's my favorite metaphor in the song that the author calls out. But it's also the one part of the song that actually makes me question if there wasn't a part of the writers of the song from the President's United States of America that had a little bit of that in mind, because the song could be argued just be like, it's about peaches. Like, all these things are just true about peaches. They're sort of sing-songy, almost childish ways to talk about it. Peaches come from a can. They were put there by a man. You could see someone saying that to a child. And then you get to go to this nice country and eat them. But then why do you have a moment where you're squeezing a rotten one in your fist? It just doesn't. It's the one thing in that pattern that stands out. Mm-hmm. And it also has such a strong, aggressive, indignant connotation. It really kind of puts that thought in me like, oh my gosh, maybe there was something, maybe it was subconscious, but I don't know. It just kind of feels like that.
Well, I think what's interesting is the fact that sometimes telling the truth about something is radical in and of itself and can be labeled as Marxist. In other words, just saying peaches come from a can, they were put by a man, and there was a factory involved. Like you said, those are all factual things, and they make a fun little rhyme.
Mm.
But that can be seen as a revolutionary attack on capitalism, even though we're just saying what's factually true about peaches.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is really interesting, is
Yeah.
that can come off that way. And I honestly do think that the truth is revolutionary many times.
Well, like we had talked about in a previous episode, there's the idea of hiding the truth from people so that you can control them because people don't need to know the truth. So I think that goes hand in hand with that.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to the introduction of tension into the song and the crushing of the rotten peach, they've already acknowledged the kind of production relationship of peaches by saying they were put there by a man and a factory was involved, which, whenever you say factory, that pulls in the idea or the fact that there's somebody that owns that factory. In a very loose way, it references the ownership of the means of production. So then when you introduce tension, I honestly think that the tension that's introduced in the song is non-specific.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really say what the tension is about. The rotten peach could be anything. Anything that you don't like, you refer to as rotten. And peaches have already been established in the song. So it's just a blank slate to put something on. But the only thing that's really been brought up in the song up to that point has been the relations of production. That the fact that a man put the peaches in there and was working in a factory. So within that context, if you introduce a blank slate of tension, it totally makes sense to interpret that as the tension between the mode of production and the person who wants to be free from it.
And not only that, but the tension resolution is very particular. As we've already stated, it is a very indignant, assertive gesture. You didn't need to do that. If you have a spoiled peach, you can throw it away. You can get rid of it. That easily could have been part of the song, but no. I mean, this is a different kind of gesture, and it's a different take on that tension. And yeah, so it's pretty clear in a lot of ways. It's kind of cool. So he calls out the sun-soaked in Bulges in the Shade as being sort of as capitalist fat cats. And what's interesting about that is the line before that. I don't know if he mentions this, but he says, "If I had my little way, I'd eat peaches every day," which implies that he can't eat peaches every day. There is a force that is put up a wall to stop him in some way from getting these peaches, making them free, like in whatever context you want to use that word free. And then he immediately afterwards says, basically, the next line is sun-soaked in Bulges in the Shade, and they're talking. The author of the essay says they're talking about capitalists. I imagine peaches when I hear that part,
Right.
but it's interesting that he did think of that because it's preceded by a line where a person is being kept from something, being kept from the fruit of his labor, as it were.
Huh.
Yeah.
Huh.
Woohoo!
Wait, do you think the peaches are the oppressor?
Oh my gosh.
The capitalist peaches.
That's why they can't have them every day.
I'll never look at the grocery store the same way in the produce aisle. Yeah. You never know.
No, I think you're onto something in the sense that the line, "If I had my little way, I'd eat peaches every day," is a stronger line to make his argument. Whereas I felt like the sun-soaking Bulges in the Shade, to say that represents a fat capitalist sunbathing, but also in the shade at the same time because his skin is too
he doesn't
pale.
get what sunbathing is.
Yeah, I felt like that was a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah. But yeah, I do think though that maybe they was coming from that idea like of want and being kept from it, and yeah.
Like subconsciously, they drew that idea, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly which line it was. So like, oh, it must be this.
Just like threw an arrow, threw a dart at it on the wall.
Oh my god, that's a great way to do analysis. Throw a dart. All right, the analysis for this one is
just a little bit off, but yeah, it still made. You can see the way those gears were turning, and it ends up kind of meaning the same thing. It's kind of cool.
Well, this was really fun. I'm glad that
Thanks,
we got a chance to read this essay and to listen to this song that I still love. This song, it was so fun just to listen to it, even now.
It's a great song by a great band. Go buy any of their albums. They're wonderful.
You know, I mentioned this before we were recording, but maybe I'll say it now too, that the one of the lead guys of Presidents of the United States, his name is Chris Ballou, and he does kids songs now. I mean, he mentioned in some interviews that what he writes now are silly songs about animals, and that's largely what he wrote about in the Presidents of the United States. Not a lot of animal imagery in this one, but I feel like I can see also the world of children coming into this. The idea of things being free, that's when you're a child, you don't work for something and then get paid for that in exchange. It's either something that your parents or guardians give you or not.
Mm-hmm.
So it's much more clear the social determination of the distribution of goods, to a certain extent when you're a child. I think that kind of plays into this a little bit too. Like, writing songs that promote capitalism, I think is actually a much harder thing to do. It's one of the reasons why you'll get a lot of essays that are kind of like this one. Maybe most songs aren't quite as ripe for this kind of analysis as Peaches.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think to write a song that is fully in support of capitalism is almost kind of just an awful song, because there's just so many places that human beings come from that aren't really in line with capitalism, that have, at least to a small extent, some beef with capitalism. And I think the world of children is part of that.
Mm.
This episode is part of the Marxism Today podcast series. Marxism Today is recorded, mixed, edited, produced, and maintained by Tony Schmidt and Red Wagner. It is distributed freely and licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Share-alike 3.0 license. To find out more about the Marxism Today podcast, visit our website at marxismtodaypodcast.wordpress.com, where you can find archives of all of our episodes available for download. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.